In 1971, a Hong Kong talk show host asked a 30-year-old martial artist to describe his philosophy in a single phrase. The answer he gave has outlived him by more than 50 years, repeated in locker rooms, classrooms, and boardrooms by people who have never seen a single one of his films. "Empty your mind," he said. "Be formless, shapeless, like water. Put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. Put water into a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Water can flow, and it can crash. Be water, my friend." Most people who quote this line have no idea that Bruce Lee arrived at it through serious, sustained philosophical study, including a deep engagement with the very tradition this channel is built around. Before he was the most famous martial artist in history, he was, by his own description, a student of Stoicism. The version of Bruce Lee most people know is the one on screen: fast, intense, almost superhuman. The version worth understanding for this episode is the one almost nobody sees: a philosophy student at the University of Washington who filled notebook after notebook with reading on Stoicism, Taoism, and Zen Buddhism, and who treated martial arts as a physical expression of ideas he was working out on paper first. He was, by multiple accounts, a more dedicated reader than fighter in his early 20s. His personal library, much of it still preserved by his family, includes heavily annotated copies of Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, alongside Taoist texts and Western philosophy. He didn't separate the physical discipline from the mental one. To Bruce Lee, the dojo and the philosophy seminar were doing the same work, training the same underlying capacity. This is worth sitting with, because the popular image of him, lightning reflexes, impossible physical control, tends to obscure the fact that he considered the mental training at least as important as the physical, and frequently said so directly. The water philosophy wasn't a slogan. It was a direct response to a specific problem Bruce Lee had identified in traditional martial arts training, and the problem maps almost exactly onto a core Stoic idea. Traditional martial arts, in his observation, trained students into rigid, fixed patterns, a fixed stance for a fixed situation, repeated until it became automatic. The issue, he argued, was that real confrontation is never fixed. It's chaotic, unpredictable, and punishes anyone who is only prepared for one specific version of events. His solution, which became the foundation of Jeet Kune Do, the martial art he eventually created, was to train adaptability itself as the core skill, rather than training a fixed set of responses. This is, almost word for word, the Stoic distinction between what is and isn't within your control. You cannot control the shape of the conflict in front of you, the specific attack, the specific circumstance, the specific person you're dealing with. What you can control is your capacity to respond to whatever shape it takes. Rigid preparation for a fixed scenario is, by definition, preparation for a scenario that probably won't occur. Adaptive preparation, building the underlying capacity to respond well regardless of the specific form a challenge takes, is preparation for what will actually happen, because what actually happens is, by nature, unpredictable. Bruce Lee had a phrase he returned to often, one that cuts against how most people, including most people watching philosophy content, actually engage with ideas. "Knowing is not enough," he said. "We must apply. Willing is not enough. We must do." This sounds almost too simple to be worth saying, but it was a direct criticism of something he saw constantly in both martial arts and philosophy: people who accumulated knowledge as a kind of substitute for actually changing their behavior. He had no patience for students who could discuss technique brilliantly but couldn't execute it under pressure, and he had equally little patience for philosophical readers who could quote Stoic ideas fluently while living in a way that contradicted them entirely. This is the same warning Epictetus gave his own students 2,000 years earlier. Philosophy is not the explaining of ideas, but the living of them. The point was never to become someone who could talk well about discipline, courage, or adaptability. The point was to become disciplined, courageous, and adaptable, which is a fundamentally different project, measured by completely different evidence. Bruce Lee's entire training philosophy was built around closing that gap as fast and as honestly as possible, treating every piece of knowledge as provisional until it had actually been tested against real resistance. It would be easy to treat Bruce Lee's philosophy as something separate from Stoicism, an interesting parallel rather than a direct descendant. The historical record doesn't support that framing. He read the Stoics directly, referenced them by name in his personal writing, and explicitly described his own approach as compatible with, and partly derived from, Stoic thought. What he added, and what makes him worth a dedicated episode rather than just another voice repeating Marcus Aurelius, was a relentless insistence on physical, embodied testing of every idea. The Stoics wrote extensively about resilience, adaptability, and the gap between what we can and cannot control. Bruce Lee took those same ideas and built an entire physical discipline designed to make them undeniable through direct experience, rather than something you simply agreed with intellectually. This is, in a sense, Stoicism with the proof built in. You cannot fake adaptability in live sparring the way you can fake agreement with a philosophical claim in conversation. The body either responds well to the unexpected or it doesn't, and that feedback is immediate and impossible to argue with. This is part of why his ideas have traveled so widely, well beyond martial arts, into business, sports, and personal development. The underlying claim that rigid preparation fails and adaptive capacity succeeds has been tested under conditions that leave very little room for self-deception. Here's something to try this week, drawn directly from this episode. Identify one area of your life where you've been preparing for a fixed, specific outcome, a particular response in a difficult conversation, a particular result from a project, a particular way you expect a situation to unfold. Ask yourself Bruce Lee's underlying question: what happens if it doesn't go that way? Not as a source of anxiety, but as a genuine planning question. Where is your preparation rigid, built for one specific shape of events, and where could you build in more adaptability, more capacity to respond well regardless of which specific version of events actually occurs? This is the practical core of being like water, not passivity, not formlessness for its own sake, but a deliberate cultivation of the capacity to take whatever shape the situation actually requires, rather than insisting the situation conform to the shape you prepared for. Bruce Lee died at 32, far too young, but the body of thought he left behind, equal parts Stoic philosophy and hard-won physical testing, has outlasted nearly everyone who has tried to dismiss him as merely an action star. Next week, we'll look at another figure whose public reputation, in a completely different field, obscures a similarly serious philosophical life underneath it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.